Station Zenith hung in the void like a mechanical flower, its metal petals stretching across 3 kilometers of cold space. Inside those corridors, beings from hundreds of worlds brushed past each other every day. The VRNN clicked and chittered as they scuttled through maintenance tunnels. The Keltorians glided in their water-filled transit tubes, their translucent bodies pulsing with bioluminescent thought. The Thaxians lumbered through cargo bays with their 4 arms hauling freight that would crush a human. This wasn't just a space station. It was the beating heart of the Galactic Council's fragile peace, where trade routes crossed and treaties were signed in a dozen languages that human throats couldn't even pronounce. And somewhere in the lower residential sectors, in a cramped room that smelled like recycled air and loneliness, lived a boy who hadn't said a word in 3 years. Elias was 12 now, though he felt older than that. Maybe it was because he'd spent those 3 years watching instead of talking. Maybe it was because he understood things that people who filled the silence with endless words never seemed to grasp. He sat on his narrow bunk in the orphanage wing, his fingers moving across a worn sketchpad. The pencil danced across the paper, creating patterns that would have meant nothing to anyone else. Swirls and symbols. Geometric shapes that felt right even though he didn't know why. The orphanage caretakers didn't know what to do with him. A VRNN administrator named Chixtal had tried at first, mandibles clicking with what Elias thought might be concern. But after months of silence, even that attempt at kindness had faded into indifference. The insectoid species valued communication, action, the constant buzz of doing. To them, a silent child was incomprehensible. Weakness. Deficiency. Something broken that needed to be fixed or forgotten. The Keltorians were worse in their own way. They could reach into minds, pull thoughts from the depths like fish from dark water. But when they tried with Elias, they found nothing. Or rather, they found walls so thick and so deep that even their telepathic probes couldn't penetrate them. It frustrated them. Some looked at him with their huge, luminous eyes full of pity. Others looked with something closer to disgust. But Elias didn't care what they thought. He'd learned something valuable in his silence. People ignored you when you didn't talk. They spoke freely around you, forgot you were there, let their masks slip. And Elias watched. He watched everything. He knew which docking bays the smugglers preferred. He knew which council representatives took bribes from the Merchants Guild. He knew about the growing tension between the VRNN and the Kolrathi, about shipments that arrived under false manifests, about the way security patrols changed their routes to avoid certain corridors at certain times. He'd mapped it all in his head, a 3-dimensional puzzle of secrets and lies that no one knew he carried. His parents had been diplomats once. Good ones, from what he remembered. His mother had this way of smiling that could defuse an argument between species that had hated each other for centuries. His father had spoken 7 languages fluently and could navigate cultural protocols like a dancer moving through choreography. They'd been important. Respected. And then their shuttle had exploded on a routine trip to the Outer Rim stations, and suddenly Elias was just another orphan in a galaxy full of them. The official report called it a mechanical failure. But Elias had seen his father inspect that shuttle personally the morning they left. Had watched him check every system twice. His parents were careful people. Too careful for random accidents. He'd stopped talking the day they told him they were gone. Not because of trauma, though the grief counselors seemed convinced of that. Not because he couldn't find the words, though they thought that too. He'd stopped talking because words suddenly seemed pointless. Empty. Incapable of carrying the weight of what needed to be said. So he drew instead. And he watched. The morning everything changed started like any other. Elias slipped out of the orphanage before the wake cycle, moving through corridors he'd memorized years ago. He liked the station when it was quiet, when the lights were still dim and the crowds hadn't yet filled the walkways. He made his way to the observation deck on level 47, a spot most people didn't know about because it wasn't on the official maps. From there, he could see the docking procedures, watch the ships come and go like mechanical birds returning to an enormous nest. That's when he saw it. The transport ship wasn't like the others. It came in surrounded by an escort of 6 military vessels, their weapon systems active, scanning the approach vector like they expected an attack at any moment. The transport itself was reinforced, its hull covered in suppression field generators that hummed with enough power to make Elias's teeth ache even through the observation window. They were transporting a prisoner. But not just any prisoner. Through the viewport, as the transport bay doors opened and the cargo ramp descended, Elias caught his first glimpse of something impossible. Something the galaxy claimed had been extinct for 10,000 years. A dragon. Its scales caught the station's artificial light and seemed to swallow it, black as the void between stars but shot through with veins of deep crimson that pulsed like molten metal. Its eyes, even half-lidded with exhaustion or sedation, burned with an intelligence that made everything else seem small and temporary. This wasn't some animal. This was something ancient. Something that remembered ages before humanity had even learned to make fire. And as those eyes swept across the observation deck, they found Elias. For the first time in 3 years, something stirred in his chest. Not grief. Not anger. Something else entirely. Something that felt like recognition, though he'd never seen a dragon before in his life. Something that felt like coming home. The Galactic Council wasted no time. Within hours of the transport docking, they had the dragon moved to Vault 7, the deepest and most secure holding facility on Station Zenith. The kind of place they kept things that could end civilizations if they got loose. The vault was designed by the Thorgrim, a paranoid species that built everything to withstand nuclear strikes and dimensional tears. Walls 3 meters thick. Energy barriers that could slice through starship hulls. Gravity dampeners that could crush a creature flat against the floor if it tried to move without permission. They named him Kael'thronak. At least, that's what the ancient database fragments called him. The name meant something in a language so old that even the Council's best linguists couldn't fully translate it. Something about fire and void and the spaces between stars. But to the Council he was just Specimen 47. A relic. A curiosity. A potential weapon. Scientists lined up for observation slots. The VRYN wanted to study his genetic structure. The Keltorians tried their telepathy and got nothing but static, like trying to read a star. The Drajan Collective wanted tissue samples, scale scrapings, anything they could use to reverse engineer whatever made him what he was. And the military observers, they just stood there calculating. Measuring his size against their weapons systems. Wondering if they could break him, train him, point him at their enemies like a living missile. But Kael'thronak didn't move. He lay in the center of that vault like a mountain that had forgotten how to be a mountain. His eyes stayed half closed. His breathing was so slow that sometimes the guards wondered if he was even alive. Days passed. Then a week. He didn't eat the food they offered. Didn't react to the tests they ran. Just existed there in his chains, silent and still as stone. Elias couldn't stay away. The first night after the dragon arrived, he lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling until the orphanage fell quiet. Then he slipped out of bed, moved through the corridors like a shadow, and found the maintenance shafts that snaked through the station's guts. He'd explored these passages for years. Knew which hatches were monitored and which ones the security teams had forgotten about. Knew the paths that would take him anywhere he wanted to go without showing up on a single camera. The vault observation deck was supposed to be restricted. But restrictions only worked on people who followed rules, and Elias had learned that rules were just suggestions enforced by people who weren't paying attention. The deck was empty when he arrived. Just a dark room with a reinforced window looking down into the vault. And there, maybe 30 meters below, the dragon lay motionless in his prison. Elias pressed his face against the glass and watched. Just watched. He didn't know what he was looking for. Didn't know why his chest felt tight or why his hands trembled slightly against the cold surface. He just knew he needed to be there. The second night, one of the guards caught him. A Kilrathi warrior with 4 eyes and an attitude that suggested he enjoyed his job a little too much. He grabbed Elias by the shoulder, spun him around, and laughed when he realized who it was. "Look who we got here," the guard called to his partner. "The mute freak come to see the dead legend. What's the matter, kid? You two gonna have a nice quiet conversation?" The other guard, a VRYN, clicked his mandibles in what passed for amusement among his kind. "Leave him. He's harmless. Probably the only visitor that thing's gonna get who isn't trying to cut pieces off it." They let him stay. After that, they always did. It became routine. Elias would show up sometime after midnight, and the guards would make their jokes and then ignore him. The mute kid and the silent dragon. 2 broken things keeping each other company. What harm could it do? But Elias wasn't just watching anymore. He'd brought his sketch pad. At first he drew what he saw. The curve of those massive scales. The way the dragon's claws left scratches in the reinforced floor. The chains that wrapped around legs thick as tree trunks. But then something changed. His hand started moving in patterns he didn't recognize. Symbols flowed from his pencil. Geometric shapes that interlocked in ways that hurt to look at but felt absolutely correct. Spirals that seemed to pull the eye inward. Lines that connected in impossible angles. He didn't understand them. Couldn't have explained what they meant if someone had asked. But they felt right in a way nothing else in his life had felt right since his parents died. Like remembering a song you'd never heard before. Like speaking a language you'd never learned but had always known. The guards didn't pay attention to his drawings. Why would they? Just a kid doodling to pass the time. 17 nights passed like this. Elias would arrive, the guards would mock him gently, and he'd sit against that window drawing symbols that made his fingers tingle. And the dragon never moved. Never acknowledged his presence. Just lay there breathing those slow, ancient breaths. Then, on the 18th night, everything changed. Elias had finished another page of symbols. His hand ached from gripping the pencil. He set the pad down and pressed his palm flat against the observation glass, just needing to feel something solid. Something real. And the dragon moved. It wasn't much. Just a shift of the massive head. But after weeks of absolute stillness, it felt like watching a planet change its orbit. Those eyes, those burning eyes that held the light of dying stars, opened fully for the first time since the dragon had been imprisoned. And they looked up. Directly at Elias. The boy's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. Couldn't think. The dragon's gaze pinned him like a specimen under glass, and he felt something pass between them. Not words. Not thoughts. Just recognition. Like two parts of something that had been broken finding each other across an impossible distance. The dragon rose. Slowly, painfully, fighting against chains and gravity dampeners and suppression fields that must have felt like mountains pressing down. But he rose anyway. He crossed that vault floor, each step deliberate, until he stood directly beneath the observation window. And he looked at Elias with an intensity that made the whole universe seem to hold its breath. The guards noticed. They stepped forward, hands on their weapons. But the dragon didn't attack. Didn't rage. Just stood there, looking at a 12-year-old human boy who'd never spoken a word. Elias's hand, still pressed against the glass, began to warm. His fingers tingled where they touched the surface. And in his head, not quite a voice but something close, he felt more than heard a single thought. Finally. The next morning, alarms screamed through Station Zenith. Emergency broadcasts crackled through every speaker. The council convened in emergency session. Because deep space sensors had picked up something approaching. Something big. A fleet. 60 ships at least, maybe more. They called themselves the Scourge, and they didn't bother with diplomatic channels. Their transmission was simple. Give us the dragon, or we'll take him from your wreckage. They had 3 days before the armada arrived. Panic spread through Station Zenith like a virus. The kind of panic that makes people forget their training and start thinking about survival instead of duty. The human quarter was the worst. Families huddled in their quarters, packing whatever they could carry. The few Earth defense vessels docked at the station were civilian transports, nothing that could stand against a warship, let alone 60 of them. Some humans were already begging for spots on any ship leaving the station, willing to pay everything they owned for a chance to run before the Scourge arrived. The council chamber became a war zone of words. Representatives from 30 species shouting over each other, their translators struggling to keep up with the chaos. The VRNN wanted to surrender the dragon immediately. It wasn't their problem, they said. Why should they risk their lives for some ancient creature? The Thaxians argued for evacuation, already calculating how long it would take to get their people off the station. The Keltorians proposed negotiation, though even they didn't sound convinced. And the humans? The human representative, an older woman named Chin who'd replaced Elias's mother, just sat there looking tired and defeated. Earth had 12 warships in this sector. Well, against 60 Scourge vessels. It wasn't a fight. It was suicide. She knew it. Everyone knew it. The debate stretched into the second day. Security around the vault doubled. The dragon remained silent, watching everything with those burning eyes. And Elias made a decision that would change everything. The council chamber had guards, of course. Big Decian warriors who took their job seriously. The kind who didn't let unauthorized people anywhere near the doors. But Elias had his sketchpad clutched to his chest, and sometimes desperation makes you brave in ways nothing else can. He walked right up to the main entrance during a recess. The guards saw him coming, this small human kid with messy hair and clothes that had seen better days. They moved to block him, already shaking their heads. Council only, child, one rumbled. Go back to wherever you came from. Elias held up his sketchpad. Pointed at it. Pointed at the doors. The guards looked at each other, confused. They didn't speak human sign language, and Elias's gestures were urgent but unclear. Look, kid, we don't have time for. But Counselor Chin was coming back from the recess, saw the commotion and recognized Elias. Her eyes widened. She'd known his parents. Had been at their funeral. And now here was their son, the quiet one everyone had written off, trying to force his way into the most important room on the station. Let him through, she said quietly. The guards looked doubtful. Counselor, regulations state. I said let him through. The chamber fell silent when Elias walked in. Dozens of alien eyes turned to stare. The VRYN clicked in annoyance. A Keltorian representative pulsed with what might have been confusion or irritation. But Elias didn't stop. He walked straight to the center of the chamber, that round space where speakers stood to address the council, and he opened his sketchpad. The first page. Then the second. Then the third. Symbols flowing across the paper. Geometric patterns that seemed to move even though they were perfectly still. Shapes that connected in ways that made the eye hurt and the mind itch. This is absurd, a VRYN counselor buzzed. We're debating the survival of this station and someone lets a child. Wait. The word came from the back of the chamber. From the Luminar section, where beings of living crystal sat in patient silence. One of them rose, light refracting through their body in rainbow patterns. They moved closer, their crystalline form humming with a frequency that most species couldn't hear but could feel in their bones. The Luminar scholar leaned over Elias's drawings, studied them, and then went absolutely still in a way that made even the arguing counselors shut up. This is impossible, the Luminar whispered, their voice like wind chimes. This is the first language. Silence. Complete and total. That's extinct, Counselor Chin said carefully. Dead for thousands of years. Before most of our species reached the stars. Not extinct, the Luminar corrected. Hidden. Forgotten. This is the language spoken when dragons and humans walked the cosmos together as one. Before the sundering. Before the war that broke reality and scattered both species across dimensional barriers. The chamber erupted. Everyone talking at once. But the Luminar continued, their voice cutting through the noise. Your history is wrong, humans. All of our histories are wrong. Humanity didn't stumble into space as a young species learning to walk among the stars. You were survivors. Warriors. Bonded to dragonkind in a partnership that held back horrors we can no longer remember. And then came the sundering and everything was torn apart. Your memories were sealed. Your connection severed. Your true nature buried so deep that you forgot what you were. The Luminar turned to look at Elias, really look at him, and something like awe flickered across their crystalline features. This child carries genetic memory. The old blood remembering itself. These symbols, they're not random drawings. They're a binding ritual. The ceremony that forges the pact between human and dragon. The connection that makes both more than they could ever be alone. Even if that's true, the Xian counselor rumbled, what good does it do? The ritual requires the true voice, yes? Words spoken with such conviction they reshape reality itself. And this child hasn't spoken a word in years. As if summoned by the discussion, a sound rolled through the station. It. Resonant. Coming from the vault levels far below. The dragon's voice, speaking for the first time since his capture, words that made the chamber walls vibrate. Bring the boy to me. It wasn't a request. They took Elias down to Vault 7 with an armed escort that could have started a small war. 20 guards, all carrying weapons designed to punch holes through starship hulls. Counselor Chin insisted on coming too, along with the Luminar scholar and a handful of other representatives who wanted to witness whatever was about to happen. The tension was thick enough to cut. Nobody knew what to expect. A dragon speaking after weeks of silence, demanding to see a mute human child. It felt like standing on the edge of something huge and irreversible. The vault doors opened with a hiss of hydraulics. The guards fanned out, weapons raised, safeties off. They weren't taking chances. One wrong move from the dragon and they'd open fire, consequences be damned. But Kale Thronak didn't move aggressively. He just stood there in the center of that massive chamber, chains glowing with suppression fields that hummed with enough power to light a small city. His scales caught the harsh lights and swallowed them, reflecting nothing back. Those eyes though. Those eyes burned with an intensity that made every guard take an involuntary step backward. Elias walked forward. His legs felt strange, like they belonged to someone else. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Something pulled him toward the dragon like gravity, like magnetism, like two pieces of a puzzle that had been separated for far too long. When he was close enough to touch the energy barrier that separated them, Kale Thronak lowered his massive head. Brought those eyes level with Elias's own. And spoke, his voice resonating through the vault like distant thunder. They think you are broken, little one? The words hit Elias in the chest. Not because they hurt, but because they were true. Everyone thought he was broken. Damage. A tragedy wrapped in silence. They don't understand, the dragon continued, that silence can be strength. Your species learned to scream so loudly they forgot how to listen. Forgot that the universe speaks to those who know how to be still. But you, child of the old blood, you remember? The guards shifted nervously. Counselor Chin moved closer, her face pale but determined. The Luminar scholar's crystalline body pulsed with light, recording everything. Kale Thronak's eyes never left Elias. Your silence is not trauma. It is preparation. In the age before the sundering, before reality tore itself apart and scattered us across dimensions, humans who sought the bond underwent the trial of quiet. Years of listening. Years of learning to hear the song of stars, the whisper of void, the language that existed before words were invented. Only then, when they had learned true silence, were they granted the right to speak with the true voice. Elias felt his heart hammering against his ribs. The dragon's words resonated with something deep inside him, something that had been waiting his whole life to wake up. Your parents, Kale Thronak said gentler now. They were not diplomats by accident. They were descendants of the last dragon-bound bloodline. Keepers of a heritage they barely understood themselves. When they died, when that light went out of your world, it triggered what had been sleeping in your blood. Your silence began the trial. Your watching, your listening, your drawings. All of it preparation for this moment. Elias's hands trembled. He wanted to speak, wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but his throat stayed closed. 3 years of silence like a wall he couldn't climb. But there is a problem, the dragon rumbled. The ritual requires something specific. To forge the bond between human and dragon, I must speak your true name. Not the designation your parents gave you. Not the label that marks you in their records. Your soul name. The word written in fire and starlight when you first drew breath. The name that only dragonkind can see. The suppression fields around Kale Thronak flared brighter. He pushed against them and Elias could see the pain it caused. Energy crackled across those obsidian scales. Smoke rose from where the chains dug into ancient flesh. But the dragon didn't stop. He pushed harder, lowering his head until it was centimeters from the barrier, close enough that Elias could feel the heat radiating from him. This will hurt us both, Kale Thronak whispered. But some pain is worth bearing. The dragon's voice dropped lower, became something that bypassed ears entirely and spoke directly to the bones. He spoke a word. A single word in the first language, untranslatable to any modern tongue. It sounded like fire being born in the heart of a dying star. Like ocean depths where light had never reached. Like humanity's first defiant roar against a universe that wanted them extinct. Like every ancestor Elias had ever had, speaking in unison across 10,000 years. The word hit Elias like a physical force. His knees buckled. His vision widened out. Every cell in his body suddenly remembered something it had forgotten. The suppression field screamed. The guards shouted warnings. But it was already too late to stop what had been set in motion. Elias opened his mouth and for the first time in 3 years sound came out. But it wasn't his voice. Not entirely. It was deeper, richer, layered with harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. Words in the first language poured from him, words he'd never learned but had always known. Each syllable reshaped reality slightly, making the air shimmer and twist. The ritual ignited. Light exploded from both of them. Not just visible light but something deeper. Something that existed before photons. The dragon's chains shattered like glass, fragments dissolving before they hit the ground. The suppression fields overloaded and died with a sound like reality screaming. Guards raised weapons, fingers on triggers, but they couldn't bring themselves to fire. Couldn't move at all. They just stood there watching something that shouldn't exist. The barrier between Elias and Kale Thronak evaporated. The boy stepped forward, hand outstretched. The dragon lowered his head, and when Elias's palm touched those ancient scales, the universe shifted. The bond formed. Not mind to mind. Deeper than that. Soul to soul. Two halves of something that had been broken for 10,000 years suddenly whole again. Power flooded through both of them, not from the dragon into the boy but from their connection. From the space between them where human determination met draconic eternity. Elias gasped, his eyes blazing with inner fire. Kale Thronak's scales brightened, crimson veins pulsing with renewed strength. They weren't just boy and dragon anymore. They were something more. Something the galaxy had forgotten could exist. Something the Scourge fleet was about to learn had never truly died. The Scourge fleet dropped out of hyperspace exactly when they said they would. 60 warships materialized in formation around Station Zenith like predators surrounding wounded prey. Their vessels were ugly things built for function over form. Hulls covered in weapon ports. Engines that burned too hot and left radiation trails. Ships designed by a species that had conquered 40 systems through pure brutality and didn't see any reason to change tactics now. Station Zenith's defenses were a joke compared to that armada. 8 defensive platforms with weapons that hadn't been updated in 20 years. A handful of patrol ships that could barely scratch military-grade armor. The station's shields could maybe hold for 10 minutes under sustained bombardment. Maybe. The civilian transports were already fleeing, engines screaming as they burned for the outer system. But most people couldn't leave. Couldn't run fast enough. They just huddled in their quarters and prayed to whatever gods their species believed in. The Scourge broadcast one more message. Simple and final. Surrender the dragon in 5 minutes or die. But something had changed on Station Zenith. Something the Scourge commanders couldn't see on their sensors. Something that made the old rules irrelevant. Elias walked through the station's corridors toward the outer hull. People stared as he passed. This kid who'd never spoken a word, moving with purpose and confidence that seemed impossible. His eyes held something new, something that made even battle-hardened warriors step aside without really knowing why. He reached an airlock on the station's outer ring. Didn't bother with a suit. Just cycled it open and stepped out into hard vacuum. And survived. Armor formed around him as he walked, not metal or composite materials, but something else entirely. Scales of energy that blazed with inner fire, covering his body like a second skin. The bond with Kale Thronak protected him, let him breathe where there was no air, kept him warm where the void tried to freeze him solid. He stood on the hull of Station Zenith, a 12-year-old boy facing down a fleet of warships, and he wasn't afraid. Behind him, the station's hull erupted outward. Not from weapons fire, but from Kale Thronak simply leaving. The dragon burst into space like a volcano given wings, his full size revealed for the first time. He was massive, larger than any ship in the Scourge fleet, his scales drinking in starlight and reflecting nothing back. Those crimson veins pulsed with power that had been building for 10,000 years of waiting. Of sleeping. Of dreaming of the day when the bond would form again. The Scourge didn't waste time on warnings. They opened fire immediately. Hundreds of weapons lit up the void. Energy beams and missiles and kinetic rounds all converging on the station, on the dragon, on the small figure standing impossibly on the hull. Elias spoke. Just 3 words in the first language. His voice carried through the vacuum impossibly, not as sound but as something deeper. Reality listened. Shields materialized around Station Zenith. Not the weak electromagnetic barriers that modern technology could create, but walls of pure force that had existed since the universe was young. The Scourge weapons hit those shields and just stopped. Energy dissipated harmlessly. Missiles detonated without effect. Kinetic rounds turned to dust. Inside the Scourge fleet, alarms started screaming. Their sensors were going crazy. What they'd thought was a simple raid had just become something else entirely. Kale Thronak moved. Not flying because that word was too small for what he did. He displaced through space, reality bending around him as he crossed the distance to the nearest warship in an eye blink. The Scourge vessel tried to turn, tried to bring weapons to bear. The dragon opened his jaws and breathed. But it wasn't fire that came out. Not in the traditional sense. It was older than fire. It was the concept of ending, of unmaking, of reality deciding that something shouldn't exist anymore. The breath washed over the Scourge warship, and the vessel just came apart. Not exploding. Not burning. Just ceasing to be, molecule by molecule, erased from existence as if it had never been built. Elias gestured, and Kale Thronak responded to the unspoken command. They weren't separate anymore. Weren't just allies. They were one consciousness in 2 bodies, human determination given draconic power, dragon eternity given human purpose. Together they moved through the Scourge fleet like a force of nature, like the wrath of something ancient and terrible that had been patient for too long. The Scourge tried to adapt. Tried new tactics. Surrounded them. Focused fire. Launched everything they had. But nothing worked. You couldn't fight a dragon bound with conventional weapons any more than you could punch through a star. Every ship that got close simply ceased to exist. Every weapon that fired was countered by words spoken in a language that predated physics itself. The battle lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, 40 Scourge vessels were gone. Just gone, unmade at a fundamental level. The remaining 20 fled, their engines burning at maximum as they clawed for the hyperspace threshold. The Scourge had conquered 40 systems and never retreated before. But they'd never faced anything like this. No one in this age had. Elias and Kale Thronak returned to Station Zenith. The dragon folded himself back through the breach, making himself smaller, fitting into spaces that shouldn't accommodate something his size. Elias walked back through the airlock, armor fading, looking like just a kid again. Except for the eyes. The eyes held the memory of what he'd just done. The council chamber was packed when they arrived. Every representative present, along with hundreds of observers watching via hologram. The silence was absolute. The Luminar scholar finally spoke, their crystalline voice shaking slightly. Are there others? Other humans with this potential? Elias smiled. It was the first time most people had seen him smile in 3 years. He spoke in the first language, and the council's translators struggled to render it into something comprehensible. Humanity has never been silent. You just forgot how to hear us. And across the galaxy, on Earth and Mars and the colony worlds scattered among the stars, others felt it. Felt the awakening. Felt the call of something ancient in their blood stirring to life. Young and old, civilians and soldiers, people who'd never thought themselves special suddenly understanding that they carried something powerful in their genes. The dragons felt it too. Felt their partners returning. In hidden dimensions and forgotten corners of reality, beings of fire and starlight opened eyes that had been closed for 10,000 years. The sundering was ending. The ancient pact was reforming. Humanity wasn't humanity anymore. They were what they'd always been, finally remembering themselves. And the galaxy would never be the same.